All right, so hi everyone. My name is Kevin Evans, and I do actually work at Concur. I have for quite a while. So the presentation we're going to go through is a little bit about how we're trying to get through this transformation to DevOps, and it really is tied very closely into our architectural changes from a monolithic application to microservices, and I would say we're very much at the start of that journey, and we've been at it for about 12 months, seriously on the microservices side. But so we'll talk a bit. I'm going to spend some time talking about the why we're doing what we're doing from a cultural change standpoint. Donnell's going to come up and talk about how we went from 0 to 120 miles per hour with New Relic in a fairly short period of time, and then Angus is going to spend a little time talking about what we're planning to do next with the APM tool and how it fits into our DevOps mentality, or what you'll probably hear me refer to more frequently as our end-to-end strategy, because we actually use the term end-to-end versus DevOps, and talk a little bit about that. So I'll get right into it. Hopefully everybody knows who Concur is, and if you don't, catch one of us afterwards. There's a number of us in the session that we can explain that. I won't spend any time doing that. What I do want to do is really talk about how we got to where we are from a historical. I'll give you a bit of history lesson around our architecture and our methodologies and so forth. So we started. Roll it back to 2003 is really when our SaaS service started. We were initially an on-premise company. We transitioned to completely SaaS about this time frame. At that time, it actually wasn't called Software as a Service. It was called something else. It was called ASP. So that's how long we've been at this game. And the reason that's important is because it really gives you some feeling for what the roots are of our architecture, because it really is an on-premise application that we transitioned into a first iteration SaaS delivery. Now we're trying to get to what we consider as a second iteration of architecture. So when we first went to the service, when we look at what we were doing from a methodology standpoint, very very waterfall, very structured from a standpoint of every stage had its cycles. Requirements were inches thick and outdated the minute that we wrote them. And all the fun things about waterfall, we had them. At that time, our release cadence was essentially about between 9 and 18 months, and so we weren't very nimble from that standpoint. But really, that wasn't unusual in this time frame. And many of you probably weren't working in the industry at that time, but this is really not that crazy from that standpoint. I think the important piece here is when we did this, we were really running our operations. Our service was really running as an IT organization that was learning how to run a service. And there weren't a lot of organizations doing it that we could copy, that we could learn from. So we learned a lot as we went through this transition from on-premise to SaaS. About 5 years after that started, we really went to kind of this hybrid mode of half agile and half waterfall, and at that time, I think what we did was we took all the things we didn't like about waterfall, those documentation pieces and all that. We just stopped doing them and said we're agile, and that was the transition that we made at that time. But the good news is we did actually change our release cadence. We became a little bit more nimble. We had multiple releases in a year instead of once every other year in some cases. Our application is still, at this stage, from an architecture standpoint, was still very much what we refer to as a monolithic hybrid, where we've taken all the things that existed in the on-premise world, we moved some of them forward, we made some of them more operationally friendly for running a SaaS service, but it was still a monolith, still very much a monolith. And I think we started to do this transition into more from an IT-focused operational organization into kind of a hosted operations is what we used to call ourselves, and change the mentality on how we worked, and really lost a lot of at that time, I think that the historical roots that came from an IT-focused organization that was just happened to be running a service for customers to use. And that was pretty meaningful. About a year and a half ago now, we started in earnest on this cultural transition, and I do call it a cultural transition, and maybe it's more a cultural revolution, and I think this story is not unique to us. What I've heard from a number of presentations already in this last 2 days is that this story looks exactly like what a lot of other organizations are doing. So moving from a monolithic design to a microservice architecture. That's pretty easy, right? You just take the code and break it up into a few pieces and run it on some different servers, and everything works great. For those of you who haven't been attempting that or in the throes of doing that, it's really not that easy. It actually turns out to be quite difficult. So that's where we're at right now in this transition. Well, I guess I would say about 18 months into this. We've really moved to, in some cases, a lot of our services are delivered on a high frequency, maybe on a daily basis, maybe even more frequently than that in some cases, on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we're still in a monthly release cadence where we still deliver our monolithic code base once a month. And then we do send out updates to that more frequently, but for the most part, our releases are once a month. The interesting thing about this is our customer base is predominantly 99.99% enterprise customers. Enterprise customers, for them, a monthly release is actually too much. They really like to see things take a lot longer to change when it's not something that they want changed, of course. But it's been an interesting cycle for us to get our enterprise customers into a level of comfort around how much we release. And obviously, as most of you probably recognize, as we move into more and more of our architecture moves to microservices, that release cadence will go much faster in many more pieces. And somehow that's going to make it a lot more stable, right? So that's the transition that we made from a kind of what I would call the general characteristics of our organization. Some fundamental principles that we outlined that came from a lot of what our CTO brought to the organization. Our CTO, Mark Nelson, joined coincidentally about the same time we started this transition to microservices. There's definitely a correlation there. I know Nate Silver would say it's not enough sample size, but in this case, I can tell you it is. So anyway, we really make the transition, and this again, if you haven't went through this same cycle, you may not be familiar with the really thinking about software differently than you think about service, and at the end of the day, making sure that we are designing our functionality and our services for just that. It's going to be a service, and it's more from a end user delivery standpoint. It's more than just what functionality can we put out there. It really has to be about how well does it scale? What's the availability characteristics of your service? What's the scalability? What's your resiliency? And these are things that if you're just developing software, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about, and it really is core to being successful in this model, as most of you probably already know. But it doesn't come built in when you just say we're building services. And I can tell you that because we built services for a long time, or at least we thought we did. But what we were really doing was building software that we were hosting. And again, this was that cycle of building software, give it to somebody else to run, let them worry about how it runs, right? That's not obviously a great model for success, or it's not today. I think we know a lot more about it. Decentralization is an important piece. Really giving our end-to-end teams, just to give you some idea of the makeup of our engineering groups. We have about 1,000 engineers that work on different parts of the travel and expense product for Concur. There's 106 agile teams as of this morning. They kind of generate themselves every day, so I'll have to check that number tomorrow. But right now it exists 106 different teams. What we're trying to accomplish is that those teams have complete ownership of their service from start to finish, end to end. And this is the term that we use going back to, we talk about end to end, not DevOps, because end to end says you have to build it, you have to be able to ship it, and you have to be able to run it. And that's really kind of core into how we're approaching this cultural shift that we're doing. And I think the last one is something that it seems like it should be pretty straightforward for everybody to, yeah, if you make it simpler and it works, that's the right way to go. That's not necessarily the experience that always happens. Sometimes we tend to try to make things all-encompassing of capabilities from the very start, even though if we don't know what all the capabilities are. So we have a mantra. It's really about developing our services in the simplest way that we possibly can. And we've been successful in some cases. In some cases, that's not necessarily the case. We actually do have complex solutions for simple problems. Okay, so just again, going back to the fundamental reasons why we're making this change. I think that most of these are probably pretty straightforward. Innovation velocity. We want to be able to deliver software services to our customers, capabilities to our customers in the fastest mode that we possibly can. Right? So that's really how do we enable our different engineering teams to move as quickly as they're capable of moving. And so it's really about driving this innovation, driving the velocity of each of our teams. This is one of my favorite ones, having been responsible for this accountability for a long time. One of the things we're doing is we're really going back to that our service is more than just the software. Each of our end-to-end teams is accountable for the operational aspects of their service. So if we have a disruption, which they happen occasionally, it's kind of a, yeah. If we have a disruption, the first people that have to really explain what's going on is not the centralized organization that we have that's called Cloud Services, which is our group. It's really the development team that owns that service. They have to explain to our CTO, to our executive leadership, what's going on with their service. Why did it fail? What was the disruption? What are they doing about it? And this has been a kind of, I would say, a critical turning point in our transition. And I don't think that without, my personal belief is without this level of accountability, our success in this transition would be much less than what it has been to date. So, and I think then the last thing, obviously we want to support our architectural change, moving away from the monolith, moving into microservices. That's really part and parcel to what we're doing as far as decentralization. So, one more slide, core principles. Again, I'll flip to these. I think they're pretty common core principles from what I see in the industry and other organizations. And I don't think that we have any secret sauce in any of these core practices that we're trying to implement. But everything obviously has to be automation. And why does it have to be automation? Is because it has to be built over and over again. It has to be built consistently. It has to be deployed consistently. Everything has to be automated. Anything that's handcrafted is going to create problems for us at some point in time. Anything that we build, and I'm sure everybody's heard the analogy of the cattle versus pets, and this is something that we take very seriously. And it's not just about, we're actually moving this model into essentially our data center process as well. So we're taking our services and saying they have to be automated from a build from start to finish. We're now looking at it from a standpoint of our entire data center has to be automated from a build standpoint from start to finish. I moved too quickly. For us, and this is really focused around some of the transition that we've made within the Cloud Services group, where, going back to the first point, we used to build things by hand, more administration. What we're doing now is we're more engineering. So we're doing less configurations and more coding is what it boils down to. And I think that's part and parcel of how we're going to be successful and consistent across all of our different development organizations, is that, well, if we want it to be consistent, if it's automated, it's got much greater chance of being consistent. If it's done by hand, there's no way it's going to be consistent. So we don't have, with few exceptions, fortunately, New Relic is one of the exceptions, but we have zero mandates within, pretty close to zero mandates as far as what has to be done with our engineering teams. So they come in and they can use whatever technology is that they feel is the right technology choices, and it goes from the front end tier, the business logic tiers, the data persistence tiers. They can use whatever they want. They can choose whatever operating system, if it's one or if it's this one or this one. They get two choices on that. And essentially, what we want to do is, if we have a preferred mode that we want development teams to work in, then that has to be the simplest mode that they can work in. And we're all developers at heart, and so we know from our training that developers are inherently lazy, and they're going to take the simplest path. So if we make the preferred path the simplest, that's what's going to happen. They're going to take that path. One of the interesting things that we do, I think that a lot of organizations do, is that when there is a culture of accountability across the board, is the changes tend to have a much higher much higher success rates as we make these changes. So it's really about pushing out the accountability for all teams for the services that they're building, and not outsourcing that accountability to somebody else, to a different group. And then I think the last point on this slide is extremely important to us, is that we don't have to blaze the trail. There's plenty of organizations that are ahead of us in this transition that have had varying levels of success and varying levels of challenges, and quite frankly, varying levels of failure as well. We should always be learning from all of those opportunities that we have. And so, this is one of the great things about coming here and being able to talk to different organizations to find out what they're actually doing. How does it equate back to what we actually need to do? All right, I'm going to do one last slide here, and this kind of gives you a general sense for how things work within. We have centralized organizations that manage some of the things that we call the rails. We have end-to-end teams that have complete autonomy for essentially what we want them to have, their complete autonomy for their build, their ship, and their run states. We want to have as much self-service in the processes as possible. We want as few things centralized as we can get away with. Centralization of any of these responsibilities really leads to bottlenecks and leads to things taking more time to get from point A to point B. If it's centralized, you got to go through another group. If there's more friction in the process, it's just not going to be the most efficient. So we do have some what I would call enterprise level requirements relative to compliance and security and auditing and the processes that we go through to do all of that. And obviously those things don't work if you try to decentralize them all. If everybody has their own process that they want to stand in front of the auditors and talk about when they come and ask us about how we're building and delivering software, that's not going to work very well. And they actually don't. Each individual team doesn't really have the bandwidth to take that on. So certain things like that get centralized because it makes more sense for us to do that. Okay, so hopefully you get a sense for why we're doing what we're doing. I'm going to turn it over to Donnell now, and she's going to give you a little bit of visibility into how we're doing it. Oh, you went.
Hi, I'm Donna Baker, manage the SRE team at Concur. Our job is to make sure that rollouts like New Relic are effective, efficient, and smooth. As Kevin said, we go to 0 to 120 miles an hour in just under 3 weeks. So a little bit about our tech stack. Historically a Java and .NET shop, but as you can see, we like technology. We go from well-established all the way to latest and greatest cutting edge. So how do we champion APM at Concur? We have a very diverse and distributed set of service teams that we like to empower through our tools, including New Relic. And how did we do this? From day one of our instrumentation, we worked with expert services to have a very effective and efficient plan for the rollout. We used training. We had a very, very tight timeline. I think 21 days is what we ended up with for the rollout. About 75% of our services instrumented in New Relic. Used the training. We had on-site help. Definitely recommend the expert services there. And we also use the customer success team. Again, making sure that everything that we do has a well thought out plan and that we're going to have a effective rollout. And the last thing, probably most important, and the thing that my team helps drive is the Rails. So I'm going to sidestep here for a quick story. Anyone here bowl? Yeah. I bowl, and I'm not great. I get a lot of gutter balls. Everyone gets gutter balls, right? It's not just me. So I used to be in a league, bowling league, legit. I actually have my own bowling shoes. I didn't bring them. So bowling league, name was Days of Our Lives, actually. Yeah, Days of Our Lives, yeah. We were about the youngest people there, about 20 years. League manager's name was Chet. Great bowler. But one day, after many of these said gutter balls, Chet comes over and says, "Stop. I'm putting up the bumpers." Okay, I'm really bad. I didn't tell you that, did I? Put up the bumpers, right? You know what? I really psyched myself out, but not only did I not hit the bumpers in that game, I had about one of the best bowling games I've ever had. And why was that? I don't know, maybe luck. Maybe also that I had to actually think about my approach. I had to stay inside those lines, or in the lane, and make sure that I was going to hit those pins. So I went from gutter balls to at least one pin each time. So how do bumpers translate to Rails at Concur? How do we keep our developers from getting the gutter balls? We came up with this plan from day one in our instrumentation. We had a standard naming convention, data center, environment, application names, or role types as we call them. Very consistent. You don't follow the Rails, you get kicked out. Sounds harsh, but that's how we make sure our developers and anyone within the organization can be successful within the tool. We also do this with server names and labels. Developers as first-class citizens. We are an API first-driven company, including the new Relic API, which is awesome, and they didn't pay me to say that. We also centralize plugins. We make sure that these are consistent. If they're customized, we're helping maintain them, and they're rolled out across all of our sub-accounts in an effective and efficient manner. So what does this equate to in terms of our coverage? Like I said, 21 days to get a full rollout. We have 29 UI apps with about 440 servers, one plugin there. 80 mid-tier apps and about 520 servers and 2 plugins there, and a lot of databases. And that's just one production account. Translates to about 4 billion transactions per month. Very proud to say 460 unique logins across our, what'd you say, 106 Agile teams or service teams. And New Relic is used everywhere. It's used in our weekly service reviews with our service teams, and it's used in over 99% of our major incidents, which happen not very often. They happen all the time, just kidding. And in fact, we just had one the other day, I'll admit, but it was really cool to see because as services were coming back online, we saw all these chats. Hey, we checked a new Relic, it's back up, it's back up. Oh, there's new Relic, there's new Relic. So great use and great seeing that use of the tool. So I told you about my bowling game. It's important to keep those bumpers up or the rails so that you can make sure your teams aren't going to get gutter balls. Have that well thought out plan from day one. So I told you about Kevin and I told you about the why and the how, and Angus will tell us about the future of APM at Concur.
Am I on? Thank you, Donnell. So just as a quick recap, you've probably heard from Kevin and Donnell just a little bit our story and how we've matured as an organization in the sense that we've gone from very monolithic tendencies, we've gone from an organization that supports a monolith to the whole notion of decentralization and really end-to-end ownership. And the APM piece to that has been a key to our success. But the thing is that we don't treat New Relic as a kind of like a different service with a different set of rules. It is a production service, therefore it needs to confine to the same rules of engagement that our services do that provide basically end user functionality. So when we talk about automated operational maturity, we talk about minimum bar, and this is this is the minimum requirements in which a service needs to adhere to from a maturity standpoint. Unfortunately today, New Relic as a service is a little bit below the bar. We talk about pets and cattle and whatnot. We're in a position where we have a lot of manual intervention in order to get a service out. Or when a service comes online, we have to create alarms manually. We have to do dashboards manually. We have a lot of inconsistencies between environments. So really the vision here is to say, we want a service to come online and the whole APM piece is enabled for you. And what this really means is if you give us some fairly simple attributes that pertain to your service, aka the role type, which is really a description of what the service is, your SLA or SLO objectives, and then an escalation path, which is important, so basically a hook into PagerDuty. With these three pieces, we could effectively create some standard dashboarding and alarming. We could create automated escalation paths. So when we have that incident, we don't have to go scratch around and try find what is this service, what does it do, who do we reach out to effectively try and get some help. And effectively, this is the zero touch or the frictionless vision that we have. This really enables that velocity that Kevin was talking about. It enables the accountability. So what we would like to see as product asks, maybe, if I could be so bold, looking at the New Relic team here, is this notion of role-based access. Today we have a series of sub-accounts where we use sub-accounts to basically stratify access to the different parts of our organization. The consequence of that is that we lose correlation density in terms of the dependencies between different services. Those that are fairly familiar with the setup of New Relic is one has to have admin rights in order to set up an alarm. So the notion of us having 1,000 developers have access via admin does scare us. So we would love to see the notion of us using an API where one can basically implement the configuration of the APM as part of the build release lifecycle. And that's what we talk about, build, ship, and run, is effectively the notion of us having all facets of the APM configuration built into the delivery lifecycle of the service. I think that's it. So we'd love to take some time if anyone has any questions.
Everybody's afraid to ask a question? Okay.
What's your roadmap for synthetics and other infrastructure features? That's a Kevin question.
This is a plant question because Jason actually works for Concur. Any other questions? Anybody awake? Answer the question. Who said that? Was somebody from New Relic to ask that question, right? Yeah. What's just the answer? It's on the roadmap. We're looking at it. Okay. I think we're done then.